But right between the two camps, the Ukrainian guy said there's a war crimes investigation site, and he said we just found a body of somebody, and the investigative team has not come in yet. So they found this body the day before, and it was the classic one you've seen on the news, the CNN and Fox, where somebody had their hands tied behind their back and then shot. And this body had also been partly burned as well. Whether that was deliberate or whether it was from artillery shell that started a fire in the area and happened to burn the body. But it was, very dramatic and very, as a human, it just tears you up to see something like that.
Welcome to Old Guy Talks to Me, a podcast dedicated to helping guys create kick-ass lives for themselves and those that they love. Ladies, if you want to know what your guy is thinking, this podcast is for women too. Each week, a special guest helps you create that life you've imagined. We talk anti-aging medicine, personal growth, relationships and hot sex. Yeah, you hear me, getting laid more frequently, other guy vices, and topics that many don't want to talk about but need to. Just because you're getting older doesn't mean you have to be old. Don't want to miss anything? Be sure to subscribe, share, rate, and review this podcast. And be sure to go to www.thestandard.academy/magazine and grab a free copy of our new digital magazine, The Standard Academy, where we talk about erogenous zones, growing hair back, and other things that will help you create that kick-ass life. Now get ready to listen up and share with friends.
I think that's interesting that you would actively choose to go and very brave that you would actually choose to go into a hot war zone. I mean, because they were at that point they were still shelling Kyiv, and there's the risk of death is not unreal. It's actually it's a possibility.
Yeah, it as it turns out, instantly I make the decision to go, and it's always floating around in your mind, and especially you haven't done that before. You're kind of trying to be careful and conscientious with your family and everything, but you also say, well, I think I need to do this. And so it wasn't hard to find a train to Kyiv, actually, but what had happened is the normal route from Lviv to Kyiv was the Russians had control of the area through the normal route, which is a kind of a relatively northeast kind of route. So the train, about 2/3 of the way there, the train detoured south and came in through the open corridor in the southwest kind of. Mm-hmm. And we, because it was slowed down in the detour, we got in after dark. And so about the last third of the trip, they pull the blinds down, and as soon as it started getting dark, they pull the blinds down and shut off all the lights except for a little green light in the cabin or in the seating area. And then when we got into Kyiv, it was under a curfew that they said was going to be 36 hours, which would have been 2 nights in the train station, which I was not looking forward to. But the mayor rescinded that, and so we ended up spending 1 night in the train station, and that was kind of eerie because almost all the lights are off, and it's cold and all. But probably the most dramatic thing was the next morning we find out that they had released the curfew, so we were able to get out at 7 the next morning. And I walked out, and Kyiv or Lviv was getting, spring was starting to affect Lviv. It was, it was warm enough that, things were starting to get, the grass was starting to green up and stuff. But I come out the train station of Lviv, and there's a blizzard going on, horizontal snow and cold, and I'm going, whoa, this is a different ballgame. And I was pretty well prepared, clothing wise, but it did get my attention. And so, but the other thing is I was finally able to get transportation to this hotel. The first hotel I had canceled on me. and said, we're only taking care of Ukrainians, and we're primarily just making food for Ukrainians. And so I finally get a cab there, and I go to this hotel. It's a fairly nice hotel, and they actually serve food. So I was in good shape in that regard, and I reserved enough nights that, at least I was taking care of myself. And but I tell you, driving through Kyiv, it was like a ghost town, and it was kind of apocalyptic. The few people out there were soldiers for the most part, very few vehicles, and they had all kinds of roadblocks. And I keep forgetting the name of those big things that look like jacks, the anti-tank,
right? Tank
kind of, deals. They were all over the place. And this hotel wasn't too far from where Zelensky was. And so there was a lot of security around there. But the curfew was on. So at nighttime, I look out this window, and all you saw was the blinking lights of the street lights, or the stop lights and stuff. And it was an eerie feeling. And I went down the next morning and talked to the receptionist, and I said, is there any other place to eat? And she says, I don't think so. There's really nothing open. And so I took a little walk, and really there was one little coffee shop that was open, and a few people were walking around with bags of food. So I think there was at least one grocery store in the area that was, supplying food. But it was really, it was pretty dramatic. And then I talked to the surgeon who suggested I go there. And so the next day, he takes me over to this little hospital where I spent the next couple of weeks. And but it does get your attention, because when we pull up, there's this big apartment complex across the street from the hospital, and there's a big chunk out of the side of the building where a missile had hit it, and then there's debris and everything scattered all across to the other side of the road where the hospital was. So there was debris and everything all over the grounds of the hospital, and most of the windows on that side of the hospital had been blown out, so they were all covered with plastic and cardboard. And then they had sandbags inside the hospital up against those windows as well. And so that starts getting your attention, that now it's a little more real, And so further west or further east you went, it became, this is more real. And there was Airraid sirens going off in Lviv 3 or 4 times a day, and Kyiv several times a day. And I think I forgot to tell you, kind of one interesting thing was, I was walking, I was in this little shop in Lviv, and there was a bomb shelter in the hotel I was at, but I went in there, and all of a sudden the lights go off in this little shop, and the ladies start gathering up their coat. And I said, well, what's going on? And they said, well, the air raid sirens, we have to go to a shelter. And I said, well, where is it? And they said, follow us. And so I followed them for about 2 small blocks, and we go through this rickety wooden door and go into these tunnels, this catacomb thing. And as it turns out, it was the catacombs of this 16th century church that had been turned into a museum. So you're going down these little tunnels, these brick-lined tunnels, bent down because they're pretty small. And they open up periodically into kind of a chamber. And it turned out to be a museum. So it was very nice and clean and everything. And it wasn't damp, as most of those shelters are damp and cold. Sure. This one, wasn't. And I spent about an hour and a half in there. And usually there was a Turkish film crew there, and a reporter and a cameraman. And they interviewed the lady next to me. And then they said, well, who are you and where you're from? And so they did a short interview there, mainly about how I was feeling about being down in that bomb shelter. But and Lviv would get hit by your periodic missiles, as was Kyiv. Initially, the day I left Lviv, it got hit with 3 or 4, I think, and they took out one of the. I think one of them hit one of the power stations and stuff. And then in Kyiv, actually, initially when I was leaving Kyiv, I think it got hit by 3 or 4 the day I left. And Lviv, just a few days ago, got hit by 6 or 8 missiles, I think.
Right.
And that's one thing you learned in this, is that you think you're safe. You're never really safe, because however far west you are, however far from the front, they can send missiles in from the Black Sea or from Belarus. And so you really have to be thinking about that. Yeah. So
So Tom, how far east did you go?
Kyiv, the farthest east I went was Kyiv.
Okay.
And what really happened, the thing that affected my experience was that right after I got into Kyiv, within a few days, the Russians quickly pulled their forces that were surrounding Kyiv. They pulled them out and they got them back into Belarus, which is about 2 or 3 hours from Kyiv.
Mhm.
And I will tell you that I got a message, and most of the time I was there, I was messaging people through some of these more secure messaging systems and or apps. And but I did get recently a contact with a fellow at the hospital I was at, and he said they got the word from the military that they have concerns that the Russians may be pushing back in from Belarus towards Kyiv. Now, I haven't heard anything more about it, but they put them on alert. And one of the things that this hospital I went to, it was a hospital, but that's not what their mission was. And it didn't turn out to be what the surgeon told me, which was somewhat disappointing. But what their role was, they had teams of what they call paramedics, which is somewhere between our EMTs and our paramedics in terms of training. But what their job was to go to the front and pick up injured people, give them emergency care, stabilize them, and then transport them back to the hospitals, the military and non-military hospitals in Kyiv. And so their other mission, and this was part of the second level military hospital system, their other mission was to train people. And so the second thing that got my attention in Kyiv was one, the building across the street with the missile hit, but the other was one of their big training things was the use of tourniquets. And Kathy and I took, the American College of Surgeons has taken the lead in trying to really get people to train to use tourniquets, our civilian population, and they call it stop the bleed. And what we learned in Afghanistan and Iraq was that about 80% is what the numbers I heard anyway, 80% of the deaths on the battlefield were from blood loss. And that you can make a significant impact if you stop the bleeding. And so what they were doing is teaching, this is real life, big time tourniquet use, not laissez-faire. This was serious tourniquet use. And they were teaching it to civilians and to a certain level of medical people. And they were not only teaching you to put a tourniquet on somebody else, the first thing they taught you is put it on yourself, because you could get injured and you need to take care of yourself. And you always carry a tourniquet in your left front pocket. And if you get injured, you put the tourniquet on yourself, then you take care of somebody else. And it's kind of like the oxygen in the airplane. Put your own oxygen mask on, then put it on your child or your partner or whatever. And that really gets your attention when they're saying, all of a sudden you're carrying a tourniquet for your own life. And then they also taught how to pack wounds, which was really good, and other basic things. So they were teaching people, their civilian population, trying to get them up to speed, because that many of these towns were like Irpin, Bucha, Bordianka, and all, were taking tremendous artillery and all bombs and missiles and stuff. And so it wasn't just the military people being injured, it was civilian. And to the extent on a place like Kyiv, there are not enough trained medical people routinely to take care of the potential number of civilian and military injuries. So they were really geared up. And that's what this one place was geared up to. And the other thing they would do is they had a staging area close to Irpin. And so we would go out to that staging area. And then if there was a need at the front, it was a much quicker, shorter drive to the front to try to take care of those people that were injured. And so that was the main role of that hospital. It wasn't what was portrayed to me initially as taking care of patients with wounds and all that, which is one of my areas of kind of expertise. But it was very rewarding, and it was more, I think it was more getting to know the Ukrainians and what they're dealing with from a from a population standpoint, what they're going through, not just their military people, but what the entire population is dealing with. And so that was probably the most significant thing of the trip is that part.
So you mentioned a couple of small towns outside of Kyiv. What did you see any evidence of atrocities?
While I was there, I ended up meeting a fellow from Arizona who was an ex-Special Forces guy, and he had brought in supplies to the military. In particular, he brought in satellite phones, which they were very appreciative of because they thought the Russians would take out communication network, and they would have been able to use that at least temporarily. So one day he gave me a call. And he said, I was delivering supplies and I'm stuck in the mud next to Irpin. And can you get some people from the hospital there to come help me? And this was after dark at night. And he says, I am hitchhiking back to Kyiv. And I went, is that a good idea? I said, maybe we can send somebody out to get you. He said, no, I think I got a trucker to bring me in. And so the next day we put together a group and we went out to Irpin and got him. I mean, he was really stuck and he had medical and food supplies with him. And so after we got him unstuck, some Ukrainians had pulled up and they helped us. And they said, we will escort you to Irpin and then we are going to Borodyanka. So you would go through Irpin and then Bucha and then Borodyanka. And so we spent the day delivering stuff and just witnessing what had happened there. And those three cities were in the news a lot because once the Russians pulled out, then the military and the press had access to those areas. And that's where a lot of the war crime stuff has been talked about. And so when we went into Bucha, I mean, the devastation, at least in the main corridor and stuff, was extensive. Borodyanka was the one that Zelensky said it was bad in Irpin and Bucha, but Borodyanka is even worse. And so we spent a number of hours in Borodyanka, and a couple things. We were talking to a older fellow who was standing in there as they had teams trying to remove the debris. And they had to have heavy equipment do it because these, pieces of concrete and stuff were huge and heavy. And so they had teams there. They felt like there probably wasn't any chance of getting somebody alive out, but they were uncovering everything. And this fellow was sitting there and he was very sad, obviously. And he had been there and just left that apartment building to walk to his own place, which is about 15 minutes away. And right after he left, the Russians were going through on the road with tanks. And my understanding was several young men threw Molotov cocktails at the tanks. And the Russians turned their tank guns and just blasted the apartment complex, the center part of the apartment complex, which was totally gone. But both sides of it were uninhabitable, but they were still partly standing. And so this fellow, after he left, his daughter-in-law was there. His son had gone somewhere else, and his daughter-in-law died in that accident and hadn't been found yet. And so we talked to him for a while through translators. And while I was standing there, one of the Ukrainians that we were with came up to me and he pointed to his nose. And I had already noticed that when I was in Haiti with the natural earthquake, it was the same type of thing. These big buildings would come down on people. And so people were trapped. Some of them were able to be, saved, but others weren't. And in Haiti, there was this, I hate to say it, but there was this smell of death. And it wasn't obnoxious smell. It was just something that was that I had never smelled before, and it gets imprinted in your brain. And standing there watching them evacuate or excavate that area was the same thing. And what it really, your mind just processes that, and it says, what that represents is the degree of destruction and suffering and death that is occurring there. And this is all civilian. This is not just the military. So that was a pretty dramatic a pretty dramatic a moment for me, and it really brings it home as to how the Ukrainians are suffering throughout the country, the impact of this. And I think that was one of the times where I'm sitting here thinking how much destruction, how much suffering, how much death is being caused by one man, Putin. And it really drove it home. And when I was talking about what motivated me to go here, the other thing I think I mentioned to you earlier was this idea of bullies. I've never really tolerated seeing that, people bullying other people. And I always felt I had to try to do something. And so this was kind of the same thing. I saw this as not the Russian people, but Putin bullying this, this democracy, this neighboring country. And I felt that was just unacceptable. And I needed to try to do something to help the effort to protect the Ukrainians in their fight, or to stand with the Ukrainians in their fight for their freedom, their democracy, their country. And so not only there's a humanitarian part, but I think most people probably around the world felt the same way, that this was one of those lopsided things, this big military power of Russia beating up on this country. And so that came through when I was seeing scenes like that. I just go, what suffering and what damage this one person is doing. And so I'm proud of the U.S. for standing up and leading the effort to help the Ukrainians.
Yeah.
Do you need accountability? Are you looking to change the course of your life but have failed to keep on track? Too often we take in information and fail to act. Do you need an accountability program to stay the course? Then go to www.thestandard.academy and find out about my accountability program that goes with my course that helps you find out what you want, why you want it, and how to get it. The accountability program keeps you on track to get results.
Tom, did you see any bodies or people that have been shot or mass graves when you were there?
I didn't see any mass graves that were still uncovered. There were mass graves in the area around Bucha and Bordianka. On the way back from Bordianka to Bucha, the Ukrainians said, we want to show you this one encampment where the Russians had been. And there was this road, and then on either side of the road, there was these huge, encampments of Russians, and they had their trenches. They had the places where they dug the tanks in and their artillery in. And then they had, these places they dug out and covered with wood and branches and tarps. And that's where the soldiers were sleeping. And it was difficult conditions. And I'm not sympathetic with the Russian soldiers, but it was not easy conditions. But right between the two camps, the Ukrainian guy said, there's a war crimes investigation site. And he said, we just found a body of somebody, and the investigative team has not come in yet. So they found this body the day before. And it was the classic one you've seen on the news, the CNN and Fox, where somebody had their hands tied behind their back and then shot. And this body had also been partly burned as well. Whether that was deliberate or whether it was from artillery shell that started a fire in the area and happened to burn the body. But it was, very dramatic and as a human, it just tears you up to see something like that. So, and when we were in Bordianka, one of the parliamentarians was there touring, and there was war crime investigators with her as well in Bordianka. But that's well known, and they had many sites that they were evaluating and everything.
Yeah, the atrocities is just it's unbelievable. I just when we started seeing the pictures here, even on TV, it was overwhelming. It was to see that, and I can't imagine what it'd be like to actually see that in person.
You're right, and I think the journalists have done a pretty remarkable job. Not without risk, but they've done a pretty remarkable job. And and that was partly by the time I got there. Like all of us, we'd seen a lot of the footage that was pretty dramatic.
Mhm.
And I think they'd actually shown footage of some poor individuals that were killed. And so it wasn't as much of a shock as it could have been, but being there in person, it is definitely, dramatic. And that was part, I kind of saw that as part of why I went, was to stand with the Ukrainians, but also to witness myself, give testament that this is truly going on. And it is a real thing. And this is a country that's everybody is affected by it. And I know I saw people with PTSD, civilians and military people, and it's a real thing. And I can't imagine, despite being in I had to go to another bomb shelter, and it was more like the ones that, because we were there and there were some artillery shells that went off. And so we went, when we were up near Irpin, we went into a bomb shelter in this apartment complex that was evacuated. There was nobody in it. And it was cold and damp and water on the floor, not completely, and, dark. And I said, I can't imagine existing in one of those for very long, let alone a couple months, like some of the people in Mariupol and some of the other cities. So, but in the end, when after the Russians pulled out, things really became kind of a lull throughout Ukraine. They were still fighting in the front, still fighting around Mariupol, in Kharkiv and Kherson. But what we started, one of the other surgeons at the place I was at, he knew people down by Mykolaiv, which is near Odessa, and that's in the south. And Odessa is a big deal for the Ukrainians because that's their remaining big port on the Black Sea. And it's pretty critical. It's somewhat critical to the world because that's one of the big areas that they can move grain, their wheat and stuff through that port. And so trying to keep that open is pretty critical. Mykolaiv is actually on the Dnieper River, but it's on the route. If the Russians were going to go to Odessa, other than by sea, they would have to go to Mykolaiv. So Mykolaiv was kind of the last stand for the Ukrainians to try to defend Odessa, other than the defense around Odessa itself. And so Mykolaiv was under pressure. The next bigger town towards the east from there was in Russian control. And then there were some villages between the two. So that was where the front line was. So this fellow was down there. And right before I left, I was on my way to Odessa and Mykolaiv, because I'd made the decision that because of the Russians had pulled out of Kyiv, that if I really was that the real need was probably closer to the front line. And so I had made the decision, along with Kathy, to head down to that area. And that was probably the toughest decision, because that was close. The front line was probably only about 10 miles away from Mykolaiv. And since I've been back, that same surgeon contacted me, and we're in communication, but he said, it's been a rough week. I lost 2 people. And they ended up, I said, well, were they military or medical? And he got back to me and he said medical. And one of them was shot and one of them was killed in a landmine. So that was the area I was moving towards. But at the same time, there was kind of a lull in activity there. And he said, I think you should wait. And so at that point, I said, it's probably time for me to return to home. But I told him, I'm willing to come back if there's truly a need. And the place that I was probably focused on would be Mykolaiv and Odessa, just because I've studied that and I kind of have a feel for what I might be able to do there.
So what are your plans now? Because you kind of hinted that you're thinking about going back, and what you're also, I know you're working on some things to support Ukraine. Tell us a little bit about what's kind of in your future.
Well, that's the other thing about war zones. Everything is somewhat unpredictable and changing all the time. And like I said, the person up in Kyiv said that they got the alert that there's some concern that the Russians might push back towards Kyiv. I would say that Kyiv and Odessa area are probably the two biggest things that in my non-military and not that knowledgeable assessment are probably two big things that the Ukrainians would want to protect.
Mhm.
And so what I didn't tell you is the Ukraine, maybe I did. The Ukrainian military system is really geared up. They've been doing, they've had battles going on in the east since 2014 with the problem with Crimea and the Donbass region. So their military medical system is functioning well. The people have a lot of experience, good teams, and the civilian medical system is good as well. So it would take something probably like an assault or a pressure on Kyiv or Odessa, Mykolaiv that they might get to the point where they would need outside people to come in to go to those areas closer to the fighting. And so that would be the thing that would probably get put me in a situation where I would consider going back. And I've got enough contacts that I'm really looking at it. I did talk to a fellow that was from Arizona that was stuck. I just got a message from him the day before yesterday, and he's all the way to the east near not Mariupol, Kharkiv, I think, or Kherson. Anyway, he's all the way over there, and he was bringing in both military and non-military aid there. So he was looking into the medical situation in that area as well. So if I felt there was truly a need in the east or the south, or even Kyiv, if they truly did try to make a push there, that might be enough to get me to go back. So I'm kind of, now that I've done it, I think I could mobilize quickly. It's no longer winter, so in terms of gear, I could cut down on the gear I'd have to take, but I think I could mobilize quicker. And I think what I have learned is that it was a journey of discovery, and I think the discovery partly was how you approach a conflict zone or war zone in terms of the risk management, what you're willing to do. And I found that while I was there, I was willing to consider more and more closer and closer to the conflict. So I think I've already gone through that learning curve. And so I think I'd be able to make a decision and mobilize fairly quickly to go if I needed to. Yeah. And like the other part of that was, I do have people that have sent in requests and for medical and non-medical and to a certain extent military equipment, particularly vests, helmets, tourniquets. There's certain types of medical stuff like battle dressings that have like quick clot and stuff that are designed to try to stop bleeding quickly. And so I've had requests for that, and I've been working with actually another Brophy guy. And we just submitted an order, and I'm hoping it all goes through. It's kind of a test case. If it works well, then we're gonna do more. And so it'll kind of depend on the situation over there. There's lots of people that are trying to give aid and stuff. And so if we see a need, then and it's helpful for people to know who it's going to rather than just giving to an entity. Sometimes they'd like to know where it's going to. So if this works out, we'll be able to have pictures of the people getting it and all that. And so people feel good about that. And I know you're working with Ukrainians that have an agency that sounds very good. And I've let that fellow know about them as well.
Yeah. No, there's lots of good agencies. Unfortunately, at the same time, I would caution people that want to help to be very careful in vetting where they're sending the money to, because there's also scammers out there, and so we've run into those where they're the money never shows up where it's supposed to. It ends up in somebody's bank account somewhere else. Right. And so it's you have to be very, very careful and there's a lot, and then there's a lot of good organizations that are well known that people can get to. So Tom, if somebody wanted to support you and what you're doing in terms of Ukraine, how would they get in contact with you?
Well, I'd be glad to talk to him. And I think your cautionary note there makes me careful, because the last thing I want to do is convince people to contribute to something and it turns out to be a scam. I like you, I'm leery of it. And I was very happy that you said, you talked to me about that one organization.
Yeah, it's called for Razum, which means together, and they're based out of New York City, and they're doing really big work. I mean,
to me, that's probably the biggest thing. I would probably support that. What I'm doing here, I'm in that kind of the early stages of trying to vet this, and if I get to a point where I think this other fellow I'm working with, we can probably cover what these guys are asking for at the moment. But they were asking for stuff like drones and GPS watches just to be able to try to increase their safety and stuff, and boots and just basic stuff. But if somebody wanted to contact me, I can give you my phone number and my email. If that's something that's helpful.
That's fine. Why don't you just say it out loud, and then I'll also make sure that it's in the show notes.
Okay, so it's Tom Rusing RUSING @gmail.com, and then my phone number here in Prescott is 928-713-3736.
Yeah.
And if anybody has trouble getting me, they can always go through you, and you have my info.
All right. Well, Tom, first of all, I want to thank you for going over there to Ukraine at risk to yourself, which is highly admirable, because a lot of people talk, but they don't do. And you certainly have ended up being a doer. And I want to thank you for sharing your story and your experiences in Ukraine, as well as some of the other places that you've gone to volunteer and help. So I commend you and look forward to maybe if you go back again to hear more about what you're doing.
Yeah, I'd love to stay in touch. And like I say, I think the Ukrainian people are very thankful for the support the United States has given them, specifically from us, but also the lead the United States is taking in trying to put together world support for the Ukrainians. They're very appreciative of that. And I think that the other thing is that when you travel like this, it makes you appreciate how lucky we are in the United States for the country we have. And despite the inefficiencies and the dysfunction, apparent dysfunction of our system, when you look at the situations of other countries, it's pretty dramatic. And the other thing I would say, and this is not to take away from Ukraine, is what's going on in Ukraine is going on in many other places in the world. And frequently most people just want peace, and it's bad. It's due to bad leadership, the egos and the greed of some of these leaders throughout the world that are causing such harm to the people of the world. And most people want simple things, just peace, and let me take care of myself and my family and my community. And so it's not only is Ukraine's a little different, but we got to realize that we have a lot of work to do to try to promote better leadership throughout the world. And so anyway, I appreciate you reaching out, Orest, and I appreciate the Brophy crew.
All right. Well, thank you, Tom. This is Orest, official old guy at oldguytalkstome.com. And I mean official because I have a Medicare card, so I'm government certified old. Remember, I want you to do several things. I want you to share, subscribe, rate, and review this podcast. And if you want to give me a bad review, that's fine too. I can handle that. And until next time.
Thank you for joining Dr. Orest and his incredible guest. Like what you heard and learned? Then be sure to do 3 things. 1, subscribe so you don't miss the next episode. 2, share this with someone who may need to hear it. 3, leave a review and rate this podcast. Opt in at www.thestandard.academy/magazine and get our free digital magazine with savings, articles, and deeper dives into cool controversy. Be the guy who takes action. Without action, you're not going to get the results you want. Thank you again, and make it a great day.